What does it mean when the first people to teach the world how to write seem to have left behind a story full of absences? In the broken light of ancient Mesopotamia, the oldest cities do not feel entirely lost. They feel withheld. Their walls have fallen, their tablets have cracked, and yet something more unsettling lingers beneath that ordinary ruin, as if memory itself had once been trimmed by careful hands. So before the body sinks fully into this softness, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this quiet work truly belongs with you. And wherever this voice finds you tonight, share your location and local time below. Somewhere between river mud and starlight, the first silence is already waiting. In the southern plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, where silt drifted and settled with the patience of centuries, the first cities rose from land that had to be negotiated with rather than conquered. Nothing there was simple. Rivers shifted their course without apology. Marshes swallowed edges. Salt crept slowly into the soil. Wind moved over open ground with a sound that must have felt almost human at night. And still, in that fragile geography, human beings built something that later generations would call the beginning: Eridu, Uruk, Ur, names that now survive like fragments of a dream murmured through clay. The old textbook said civilization began there because writing appeared, because temples rose, because labour could be counted, grain could be measured, authority could be named. But that explanation, for all its usefulness, has always carried the stillness of a sealed room. It answers too quickly. It does not linger long enough beside the strangeness. For the deeper unease begins with the speed of it. Villages did not merely become cities in a gentle and transparent line. Something in southern Mesopotamia seems to gather itself, condense, accelerate. Suddenly there are monumental precincts, priestly structures, administrative systems, symbols pressed into wet clay, and a social order that already feels practiced. Uruk in the 4th millennium BCE was not a hesitant experiment. It was large, organised, and conceptually ambitious. The city did not speak in the shy language of a first attempt. It spoke as though it had remembered something. Archaeologists, of course, do not phrase it that way. They speak of gradual development, of Ubaid foundations and Uruk expansion, of environmental opportunity and hydraulic cooperation, and they are right to be careful. Yet caution does not dissolve the feeling that one is standing before a threshold, already worn smooth by older footsteps. The first civilization is often described as though it were innocent of history, as though it stood at dawn with no shadow behind it. But even the Sumerians, if that convenient name can hold such a varied world, didn't imagine themselves as existing in a blank universe. Their stories leaned backward. Their kings ruled after a flood. Their wisdom came from beings associated with deep time, with the sea, with divine instruction. Their temples were not celebrations of novelty. They were acts of restoration, alignment, and continuity. Again and again, early civilizations speak less like inventors than inheritors. That does not mean every myth is a hidden chronicle, or that every sacred narrative conceals a lost science. It simply means the oldest voices do not sound as if they believed they were the first to know anything worth knowing. They sounded like survivors of a rupture, arranging fragments into order before the fragments vanished again. Perhaps that is why the ruins of Mesopotamia disturb so many imaginations. Not because they are merely ancient, but because they sit at the uneasy border between record and erasure. Clay tablets survive fires that would have destroyed papyrus, and so the region gives modern humanity extraordinary access to old thoughts. Contracts, hymns, king lists, incantations, astronomical observations, laments. Yet abundance can mislead. Thousands of tablets have survived, but survival is not completeness. Archives favour institutions. Temples preserve what serves temples. Palaces preserve what serves kings. Bureaucracy is rarely interested in the full human truth of its own age. It preserves tax, tribute, grain, rank, ritual, decree. What disappears is harder to count. Doubt, dissent, local memory, defeated explanations, unwanted ancestors. The silence around ancient beginnings may not be the natural silence of time alone. It may also be the silence produced whenever power decides what deserves durability. There is a reason so many of the earliest written marks were tied to accounting. To count is not only to understand, it is to control. A jar of oil, a ration of barley, a flock, a worker, a parcel of land, once represented, each can be supervised from a distance. Writing, in this early form, did not emerge first as literature drifting softly toward the soul. It emerged in part as a technology of management. That is not a disappointment, it is a revelation. The first archive may also have been the first filter. Once a civilization learns how to record, it also learns how to formalize memory, how to elevate some facts and leave others unshaped. The clay tablet becomes a witness, yes, but a selective one. And selective memory, over generations, can harden into official reality. That possibility becomes more haunting when one remembers how often ancient Mesopotamian sites were built atop older ones. Each generation laid bricks over previous foundations. Each sacred platform rose above an earlier sacred platform. Each act of continuity was also an act of burial. Beneath the visible city there was often another city, and beneath that another arrangement of walls, ovens, paths, thresholds, debris and bones. A tell is not simply a hill, it is memory compacted by repetition. To excavate it is to move through stacked acts of forgetting. Civilizations do not only lose their past when invaders burn libraries or rivers flood settlements, they also lose it by continuing, by rebuilding, by honouring what came before in language while physically sealing it under fresh certainty. And then there is the flood, waiting already at the edges of the story like a shadow that refuses to choose a single shape. Long before later scriptures gave the catastrophe a different moral architecture, Mesopotamian tradition had already placed a great inundation between worlds. In the Sumerian King List, kingship descends from heaven, dynasties rule, then the flood sweeps across the land and afterward kingship descends again. Whether this reflects one remembered disaster, many overlapping river traumas, or the symbolic need to divide time into a pure before and a wounded after is still debated. Yet the emotional function is unmistakable. Flood stories do not merely describe water, they describe interruption. They tell listeners that whatever came before has become difficult to verify. The flood is both event and permission. Permission for gaps, for missing lines, for claims that cannot be checked, because the old world lies beneath mud. Modern scholarship has offered many grounded reasons for these distortions of memory. River migration, salinization, urban collapse, linguistic change, conquest, selective copying, archive loss, the ordinary violence of climate and time. None of these explanations is trivial, each one matters. And still, the emotional puzzle remains intact. Why do the earliest keepers of written memory so often speak as if they inherited a damaged past? Why do the first cities of history arrive carrying myths of descent, rupture, restoration, and sacred legitimacy? Why does origin itself seem narrated as recovery rather than beginning? These questions do not prove a hidden civilization, nor a conspiracy broad enough to satisfy restless modern fantasy. They simply ask the listener to become suspicious of the word first. First may not mean original. It may mean earlier surviving. It may mean earlier sanctioned. It may mean the first chapter that power allowed to remain legible. So the night settles a little deeper around those old river plains, and the cities begin to look less like cradles and more like thresholds guarded by missing names. The first civilization may not have hidden everything on purpose. Loss can happen through flood, brick dust, empire, neglect, and the quiet indifference of centuries. But it is harder to dismiss the thought that concealment can also wear sacred robes, administrative logic, and royal ceremony. Somewhere, before the tablets that survived, there may have been other stories that did not serve the new order well enough to be pressed into clay. And if that is true, then the oldest secret in history may not lie in what the ruins reveal, but in what the ruins were designed to leave beneath them, sleeping just long enough for a later world to mistake silence for innocence. The silence left at the edge of those buried cities does not remain still for very long. Once the mind lingers there, another disturbance begins to form. If the first civilization truly emerged in the way simplified history prefers to imagine it, why do its earliest urban centres appear with such unsettling confidence? Why do they seem to stand not like fragile experiments, but like places that already understand hierarchy, ritual, labour and scale? In the oldest layers of southern Mesopotamia, the question is not simply how cities were built, it is why they look, from the very beginning, as if they had already practiced being cities somewhere beyond the reach of memory. Uruk is often placed at the centre of this unease. By the late 4th millennium BCE, it had grown to a size that made it unlike the villages and towns around it. Monumental architecture rose from the plain, districts formed, workshops produced goods with a degree of organisation that suggested not scattered improvisation, but systems. Seals marked ownership or authority. Clay tablets carried signs that were moving toward writing. The city's sacred precincts were not accidental clusters of buildings. They were statements. Human beings had begun arranging matter, labour, and belief into an order large enough to outlive individual lives, and yet the more solid that achievement appears, the more mysterious its momentum becomes. It is one thing for a settlement to grow. It is another for a civilization to assemble so many conceptual tools at once. The usual explanation is persuasive on the surface. Over long centuries, farming intensified, irrigation networks expanded, populations increased, trade widened, and institutions became more complex. Temples coordinated surplus, elites emerged, administration matured. Eventually, the village gave way to the city, and the city gave way to the state. Nothing in that account is inherently false, but its smoothness can disguise the emotional and intellectual discontinuities that still trouble the record. A process can be gradual and still feel, from the vantage point of surviving evidence, strangely abrupt. The archaeological layers do not always present the listener with a neat unfolding. They offer concentrations of change, dense moments in which many aspects of human organisation appear to crystallize together. It is that clustering that gives the beginning its aura of secrecy. Even the landscape complicates the story. Southern Mesopotamia was not a stable stage waiting patiently for history to enter. It was unstable ground, shaped by alluvium, river branches, marshland, and the slow violence of water. To create enduring urban life, there required not only labour, but coordination across time. Fields had to be maintained. Canals had to be dug, cleared, redirected, defended. Surplus had to be stored against failure. The temple and the administrative household did not arise simply because people liked order. They arose because survival in such a place rewarded systems large enough to absorb uncertainty. Yet this necessity raises another question. If the environment demanded sophisticated cooperation so early, then perhaps what is called the birth of civilization was also the birth of centralized memory. Whoever managed water, grain, labour and ritual would not merely guide the city's future, they would shape its story about itself. That story, from the beginning, seems curiously polished. The great precincts at Uruk, with their platforms, temples and repeated rebuilding phases, suggest more than devotion. They suggest continuity curated into visibility. Sacred authority was placed where everyone could see it. The architecture taught obedience without speaking. Height itself became argument. When a sanctuary stands above the houses of ordinary people, the city learns to imagine the divine, and therefore power, as something elevated, mediated, and inaccessible. This is not yet censorship in the later sense, but it is already selection. Certain spaces are made permanent, certain meanings are rehearsed until they feel inevitable. The city becomes not only a place to live, but a machine for arranging perception. And then there is the troubling elegance of early administration. Tokens, numerical systems, ration lists, seal impressions, and proto-cuneiform signs show a world becoming legible to itself in a very particular way. But legibility is never neutral. A field becomes measurable. A worker becomes countable. A delivery becomes verifiable. A transaction becomes real because it has entered the archive. These are practical achievements, yes, but they also mark a transformation in what counts as truth. Once the written or semi-written record begins to matter, unwritten realities start to fade in authority. The village memory held in song, gesture, kinship, or local ritual can be overshadowed by the tablet, the seal, the marked container. In that shift lies one of the earliest forms of concealment. The old world does not have to be burned, it only has to be outranked. Perhaps this is why the earliest cities seem older than themselves. They are not merely accumulations of houses, they are instruments for standardizing reality. Standardization has a calming appearance when viewed from a distance. It looks like progress, coherence, advancement. But from within lived experience, it may have felt like compression. Local gods folded into wider pantheons, regional customs subordinated to urban ritual. Oral memory reduced in prestige beside managed record. The city gathers many lives, but it also flattens them into forms it can supervise. So when later generations look back and see the first civilization standing in apparent completeness, they may be seeing not the beginning of everything, but the first successful consolidation powerful enough to make its own version of the beginning appear natural. The old city of Eridu deepens the unease in a quieter way. Long remembered in Mesopotamian tradition as an ancient and sacred place, it carries the weight of beginnings in both archaeology and myth. Its temple sequence stretches back into the Ubaid period, suggesting continuity over extraordinary spans of time. Layer upon layer, shrine upon shrine, the same holy centre is renewed. This can be read as piety, and surely it was, but it can also be read as a ritual of controlled inheritance. What was preserved was not the whole past. What was preserved was a line of legitimacy. Rebuilding the same sacred place again and again tells the community that its order comes from deep time. Yet each rebuilding also edits. Materials change. Meanings shift. Old traces are entombed beneath new sanctity. The shrine becomes older by becoming less transparent. By the time kingship fully enters the picture, the city is already prepared to receive it. That is what makes the emergence of rulers so unsettling in these early contexts. Kings do not appear in an empty social field. They arrive in landscapes already trained by temples, accounting, labour hierarchy, and symbolic architecture. Power does not invent itself all at once. It condenses through institutions that make obedience seem reasonable long before coercion has to show its face openly. And when kings later commission inscriptions, claim divine favour, or place themselves inside sacred continuity, they are stepping into a memory system that existed before them and was waiting to be used. The first civilization did not only build walls and canals, it built a framework through which authority could declare itself ancient even when it was new. This may be the first real fracture in the comforting myth of origins. Civilization is often described as the moment humanity stepped into history. But perhaps it was also the moment history became vulnerable to curation, on a scale previously impossible. Once cities grew large enough to preserve, they also grew large enough to omit. Once institutions could remember, they could decide what forgetting should look like. The brilliance of the early Mesopotamian cities remains real. Their innovations changed the structure of human life. Yet the glow of that brilliance casts a long shadow. In its light, certain beginnings become visible. In its shadow, others are lost, absorbed, or renamed. So the ancient plain grows more crowded in the imagination. Not with answers, but with presences half seen. Temple walls rise from mud brick foundations. Canals glint and vanish into reed-thick distance. Scribes press signs into wet clay, while older voices recede into unrecorded air. And behind the splendour of what is called the First City, another possibility waits in stillness, that these places did not simply invent the world they presented, they organised it, purified it, and made it official. Which leaves a quieter, more dangerous question drifting forward into the dark. If the first great cities already knew how to shape memory, then who first taught them what needed to be forgotten? What survives from the oldest civilizations is rarely a confession. More often, it is a performance of certainty. A king is named, a city is linked to a dynasty, a victory is attached to divine favour, and the line of rule is presented as if it had descended through time without fracture. Yet one of the strangest documents from ancient Mesopotamia refuses to sit quietly inside that pattern. The Sumerian King List, with its measured sequence of rulers, cities, floods, and reigns, feels at first like a precious historical scaffold. But the longer one lingers over it, the more it begins to resemble something more complicated. Not a simple record of the past, but a carefully assembled bridge between memory and authority, built precisely where the ground had become unstable. The document is famous for a reason. It opens in a way that still carries a peculiar chill. Kingship, it says, descended from heaven. It did not emerge from argument, gradual consensus, or local experiment. It arrived already sanctified. Then a series of antediluvian rulers appear, men said to have reigned not for years or decades, but for spans so immense they seem to belong to myth rather than history. Alulim of Eridu, Al-Alangar, and others who ruled before the flood are granted reigns measured in tens of thousands of years. Afterward comes the great rupture, the flood itself, and then kingship descends once more, moving from city to city in a sequence that gradually enters territory more familiar to historical reconstruction. The effect is unsettling. The list does not simply preserve names, it divides time into sacred distances, making the earliest past feel at once grander and less verifiable. The easiest response is to dismiss the vast reign lengths as pure legend. And indeed, no responsible historian treats those enormous spans as literal in the ordinary sense. Numerical symbolism, scribal convention, theological meaning, and dynastic inflation all offer more grounded ways of reading the text. Yet dismissal is too quick. The problem is not that the King List contains mythic material. The problem is why myth and administrative sequence were woven together so deliberately. Someone, or rather a tradition of scribes and political centres, wanted the past to appear in this shape. Someone wanted the oldest rulers lifted beyond ordinary time, the flood placed as a dividing wound, and post-Diluvian kingship arranged in a line that could support later claims of legitimacy. That is where the list becomes more than a curiosity. It becomes evidence of memory under management. Scholars have long noted that the surviving versions of the King List were likely compiled in forms useful to later dynasties, particularly under rulers who benefited from the notion that kingship was singular, transferable, and divinely sanctioned. In this view, the document did not merely report who had ruled, it taught a political theology. At any given time, only one city held true kingship because kingship itself was imagined as a cosmic office passing from place to place. That concept was not innocent. It transformed conflict into inheritance. It made conquest look like destiny. It allowed a ruler standing in the present to claim not only power, but continuity with the very structure of the world. And once that motive is seen, the earliest portions of the list begin to feel less like primitive confusion and more like purposeful mist. The impossibly long reigns before the flood create distance. Distance creates reverence, and reverence discourages scrutiny. A ruler who belongs to a realm of impossible antiquity cannot easily be compared with ordinary men. The deep past becomes ceremonial rather than investigable. It is still remembered, but remembered in a form that protects it from direct challenge. One might say this is simply how myth works, But myth in the hands of an administrative civilization becomes more than an inherited story. It becomes architecture. It supports the visible order above it. The flood itself deepens this architecture of concealment. Within the King List, the flood is not narrated in detail. It functions more like a blade. It cuts history into before and after. Everything before it becomes magnified and uncertain. Everything after it becomes reorganized into a sequence more suitable for political use. This division matters because it solves a problem faced by many early civilizations: how to acknowledge the antiquity of the world while preserving room to remake it. A flood allows both. It honors what came before by making it ancient and powerful, yet it also places a justified opacity over it. If records are missing, if continuity is broken, if old claims are difficult to verify, the flood has already explained why. Disaster becomes the guardian of ambiguity, and perhaps that is why flood memory persists so stubbornly in Mesopotamian tradition. The alluvial plain knew real inundation, real river violence, real destruction. Settlements were abandoned, rebuilt, or buried under sediment. Human communities did not need to invent the emotional truth of catastrophic interruption. But once catastrophe enters tradition, it can be used to frame collective memory itself. A world broken by water is a world in which official narratives can begin again with unusual freedom. The listener is left with a troubling possibility: that the flood in these texts is not only a memory of natural violence, but also a device for governing what can be said about what came before. There is another silence in the King List that deserves attention. Women are almost entirely absent as agents of rule, despite the fact that Mesopotamian religion, economy, and household life were not structured without powerful female presences. Defeated lines vanish quickly. Local complexity is compressed. The roughness of lived political life is refined into procession. Even when historically attested rulers begin to appear, the list remains selective in revealing ways. Some dynasties are emphasized, others are minimized or excluded. This is not unusual for ancient statecraft. Every civilization edits, yet the calm authority of a list can conceal the violence of that editing. To list is to imply completeness. To sequence is to imply legitimacy. A document that looks orderly can hide 100 arguments that were lost before they reached clay. The ancient scribe seated before wet tablets and inherited formulas may not have thought in modern terms about propaganda or suppression. Such language can be too crude for the subtler work of tradition. More likely, he served a world in which truth was already braided with ritual, cosmic order, and royal necessity. To preserve the past was not simply to report it. It was to align it. A misaligned past was dangerous. It threatened the present arrangement of heaven, temple, city, and king. In that sense, the King List may reveal something fundamental about the first civilizations. They did not merely fear chaos in rivers or fields, they feared chaos in memory. And to prevent that chaos, they created narratives strong enough to hold authority together even when the evidence beneath them was uneven. Modern readers are tempted by extremes. Some reduce the King List to fiction decorated with occasional facts. Others, especially outside mainstream scholarship, mine it for proof of lost ages, antediluvian beings, or historical knowledge too radical for conventional academia. Neither impulse quite reaches the quieter truth. The document is neither transparent history nor useless fantasy. It is a crafted threshold. It preserves genuine names, genuine political concepts, genuine cultural anxieties, and genuine attempts to make sense of deep time. But it preserves them in a form already shaped by selection, symbolism, and power. That is what makes it so haunting. It does not lie plainly. It remembers in a way that obscures, so the listener is left standing in an old corridor of names, hearing echoes lengthen as they move backward toward the flood. Kingship descends from heaven. Cities rise and fall. Reigns stretch beyond human scale. Water erases the line, then the sequence resumes, more orderly now, more usable. It is difficult not to feel that one is being guided through a past that has been arranged like a sacred chamber, where what is shown is meaningful precisely because something else has been hidden behind the wall. And if the first great list of rulers was already teaching the world how to inherit a curated beginning, then another unease begins to gather in the distance. Perhaps the earliest secret was not who ruled before the flood, but who decided how the flood would be remembered at all. Water does not only destroy, it rearranges memory. It softens edges, carries away boundaries, buries walls beneath silt, and leaves behind a surface so calm that later eyes may never guess what was taken from below. Perhaps that is why the flood in ancient Mesopotamian imagination feels larger than an event. It feels like a method, not merely a disaster, but a veil placed between one human age and another. And once that veil has been lowered, the past behind it begins to change its texture. It becomes harder to touch. Names lengthen into myth. Foundations dissolve into story. The world before the water remains visible only in flashes, like stone glimpsed beneath a moving river. In the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, flood was not abstraction. It was part of the rhythm of existence, though never a rhythm gentle enough to be trusted. Rivers fed life, but they also ignored human certainty. They shifted course. They burst their banks. They left behind fertility and ruin in the same gesture. A settlement could prosper because of the river and suffer because of it in the very same century. This is one reason the great Mesopotamian flood traditions endure with such emotional force. They were not born in a desert of pure invention. They emerged from a world that knew water as giver, taker, and judge. Yet what is most haunting is not that floods happened. It is the way one flood, or the memory of many floods compressed into one, came to divide history itself. The Sumerian flood tradition appears in several forms, most famously through the figure later known in Akkadian as Utnapishtim and in the earlier Sumerian tradition as Ziusudra. In these narratives, the gods decide that humanity will be destroyed by water, but one man is warned. A vessel is prepared, life is preserved, and afterward the survivor stands at the threshold between annihilation and renewal. Even when the details differ across tablets and centuries, the structure remains uncannily stable. There is a world deemed unstable or offensive, a warning given in secret, a container of survival, and a remnant carried into the future. It is tempting to read these stories only as literary ancestors to later sacred texts, but that would miss the quieter question resting inside them. Why do the first literate civilizations imagine their deepest rupture as something survived by only a few, and remembered only through selected testimony? Part of the answer may lie in geology rather than theology. Southern Mesopotamia was formed by sediment, migration, and alluvial change over immense periods. Archaeologists have found evidence at some sites of flood layers or abrupt depositional events, though not always in ways that support a single universal catastrophe. At places like Shuruppak, Kish, and Ur, layers of silt have at times invited speculation about large regional floods. Yet the evidence does not settle into one clean historical moment. Some flood deposits differ in date and scale. Some are local, some are ambiguous. That uncertainty matters. It means the tradition may not be the memory of one overwhelming event alone, but the cultural distillation of repeated trauma, carried across generations until many waters came to speak with one voice. A civilization formed in such a landscape might not need one great flood to imagine the end of a world. It only needed enough losses that one could be made to stand for all of them. And still, the emotional power of a singular flood persists, because it does something history alone cannot do. It simplifies the wound. It gathers scattered destruction into a moral and symbolic threshold. The world before becomes unified because it is gone. The world after becomes meaningful because it has survived. In that sense, flood narrative is an act of compression. It transforms countless local griefs into a single civilizational memory. Yet compression is never innocent. What gets compressed also gets edited. Ambiguity is reduced. Contradictions blur. The flood becomes not just something that happened, but something that explains why so much else cannot be fully recovered. Missing records, vanished settlements, broken continuity, the opacity of origins, all can rest under the shadow of that water. This is where the story darkens slightly. For once catastrophe becomes the accepted boundary between eras, it can serve power as effectively as it serves memory. A broken world is easier to reorganize. A post-catastrophic society can claim necessity, restoration, even sacred mandate. In Mesopotamian texts, kingship descends again after the flood. Order returns, but not as mere continuation. It returns as reauthorized structure. The break itself becomes part of legitimacy. The new order is not simply what followed, it is what was permitted to follow, and that distinction matters. It suggests that disaster, whether natural in origin or magnified in tradition, can become the foundation on which later systems justify their own version of reality. There is something deeply human in this. Communities traumatized by collapse often tell stories that stabilize meaning. They must. Without some pattern, suffering remains too raw, too shapeless. The flood story offers pattern. It says there was warning, there was selection, there was preservation, there was a path through the waters. But pattern has a cost. It can privilege the survivor's account over the silence of everyone else. It can transform contingency into destiny. It can make the future look chosen rather than improvised. If only one arc remains, then only one memory receives sacred continuity. Everything outside it sinks, not only physically, but narratively. This may be why flood myths across cultures continue to fascinate both scholars and those drawn to more controversial theories. Some hear in them traces of ancient climate upheaval, glacial melt pulses, Black Sea flooding hypotheses, or regional river catastrophes. Others hear encoded testimony of a lost antediluvian civilization, a prior age of knowledge erased and then selectively inherited. Responsible history cannot affirm what evidence cannot sustain. Yet it would also be too simple to dismiss the emotional logic that keeps such theories alive. They persist because flood traditions are already stories about discontinuity. They already announce that something came before, but cannot now be seen clearly. When the official archive begins after a deluge, suspicion naturally drifts toward what the waters may have taken, and what later authorities may have preferred to leave under them. The ancient Mesopotamians did not need modern conspiracy to feel this unease. Their laments, myths, and royal texts already reveal a civilization haunted by fragility. City could fall, canals could fail, temples could be desecrated, the favour of the gods could shift. In such a world, the flood was more than a memory of water. It was a metaphor for the instability beneath order itself. Every wall stood against it. Every tablet defied it briefly. Every dynasty pretended in its own way that the waters had been mastered. But perhaps no one ever fully believed that. Perhaps that is why so much early Mesopotamian writing carries an undertone of restoration, as though the world had already been broken once and might at any moment remember how to break again. So the image remains, a plain of mud brick and reeds, of canals cut through uncertain earth, of distant temple towers lifting above wet horizons. Somewhere in the old imagination, rain begins, or riverbanks fail, or the sea pushes inland in memory if not in fact. The line between history and symbol blurs, and human beings, terrified of losing not only life but continuity, place their trust in a vessel, a chosen witness, a surviving text. Yet every arc, literal or metaphorical, preserves by excluding. It carries something forward and leaves something else to drown. And as the waters recede from this part of the story, one quieter thought is left drifting in their wake. Perhaps the greatest power of the flood was not that it erased the old world, but that it taught the new world how to speak in the name of what could no longer answer back. After the waters recede in memory, stone and mud brick begin their quieter labour. A city does not return to itself all at once. It returns by marking out sacred ground, by naming a centre, by teaching frightened communities where order now resides. In ancient Mesopotamia, that centre was so often the temple that it becomes difficult to separate the birth of organised civilization from the rise of those who stood nearest the sacred threshold. If kingship would later claim splendour, it was the temple that first learned how to hold continuity in its hands. And with continuity came something gentler in appearance, but perhaps no less powerful than force, the authority to decide what the past meant. The temple in early southern Mesopotamia was never only a place of prayer in the modern sense. It was storehouse, workshop, archive, ceremonial axis and economic heart. Grain moved through it, offerings moved through it, land, labour, livestock, textiles and obligations flowed through it in ways that made the sacred inseparable from administration. The gods did not merely receive devotion, they anchored systems. Around their houses, human beings learned where to bring produce, where to seek favour, where to witness ritual, where to accept that visible life was tied to invisible order. This fusion of the holy and the practical is one of the oldest features of civilization, and one of the easiest for later generations to underestimate. For once, sacred space governs material survival. It also begins to govern interpretation. A people do not merely eat under such a system, they remember beneath it. That is why the priestly figure, however varied across centuries and cities, begins to cast such a long shadow over the earliest record. The priest was not simply a believer, nor a detached custodian of symbol. He was often part of a class trained to maintain correct relations between heaven and earth. Ritual precision mattered because the cosmos was imagined as fragile in ways both spiritual and agricultural. If the rites failed, perhaps the river would fail. If the offerings were neglected, perhaps the fields would answer with bitterness. In such a world, the guardians of ritual naturally became guardians of continuity. They kept calendars, observed celestial patterns, preserved hymns, managed offerings, and oversaw procedures whose repetition made the city feel stable against the chaos beyond its walls. Yet repetition is never mere preservation. Repetition selects. It teaches a population which gestures deserve to survive, which names deserve to be spoken, which ancestors deserve the dignity of recurrence. One begins to sense here a subtler form of concealment. Not the dramatic hiding of a library in some imagined underground chamber, but the quieter concealment that occurs whenever one version of reality becomes sanctified through use. If a temple hymn is sung for generations, while older local songs vanish from formal ceremony, the result is not silence in the obvious sense, it is replacement. If a god's cult is expanded and standardized across a wider urban network, smaller traditions may not be violently erased, but they can be absorbed, subordinated, renamed, or rendered provincial. The temple preserves much, but it also smooths. It takes the uneven religious terrain of many communities and reshapes it into something legible to the city. In doing so, it may save memory from chaos while also narrowing what counts as acceptable remembrance. The architecture itself reveals this instinct. Temples in Mesopotamia were rebuilt again and again on the same sacred sites, their foundations layered one above another. To later eyes, this looks like devotion to place, and it certainly was. But it also suggests a civilization deeply invested in controlled inheritance. A shrine from one age does not remain openly exposed to challenge from the next. It is encased, elevated, given new form, joined to fresh ritual meaning, and folded into a more authoritative continuity. The sacred centre becomes older and more legitimate with each rebuilding, yet often less transparent. What lies beneath is acknowledged in principle, but no longer allowed to speak in its original form. It survives as foundation, not as argument, and because temples were embedded in the economic life of the city, their power to define reality expanded beyond ritual into record. Early tablets associated with temple households track goods, rations, personnel, and deliveries. This is not an incidental administrative habit. It is an expression of a world view. The temple does not simply bless the city. It renders the city measurable in the sight of the divine order it claims to serve. A worker becomes part of a ration system. A field becomes tied to obligations. A flock becomes traceable through marks. The sacred and the bureaucratic grow together. And in that growth, memory begins to harden into institution. What is recorded in temple contexts acquires a gravity that everyday human recollection cannot easily resist. But official memory always has edges. The temple archive, like every archive, is shaped by function. It does not preserve the totality of lived experience. It preserves what matters to maintenance, legitimacy, and recurrence. The widow's private fear, the farmer's local myth, the defeated rival cult, the older custom that no longer fits the city's ritual order, such things rarely survive with equal clarity. They linger indirectly, in anomalies, in traces, in later condemnations, in odd survivals of symbol that no longer fit their surroundings cleanly. This is one reason the earlier civilizations can feel so close and so distant at the same time. They have left many records, but those records come from rooms where selection had already happened. The silence one feels is not the absence of writing. It is the presence of writing shaped by institutions. It would be unfair, though, to imagine the priestly class only as suppressors. They were preservers in the deepest sense. Without their devotion to formula, sequence, celestial timing, and sacred speech, much more would have dissolved. They maintained continuity through floods, invasions, dynastic turnover, and the ordinary erosion of communal life. Hymns endured because someone repeated them. Ritual calendars survived because someone kept count. Myths were copied because someone believed they mattered. And yet that is precisely what makes the question more difficult, not less. Preservation and editing are often the same gesture seen from different angles. To save a tradition is to give it form. To give it form is to choose. To choose is to leave something else outside the gate. This may explain why the earliest religious memory of Mesopotamia often feels both profound and guarded. The gods are ancient, but their stories come to us through curated channels. Wisdom appears as gift from divine or semi-divine beings, yet always in ways ratified by structured tradition. Sacred knowledge descends, but it descends into institutions. That pattern matters. For once knowledge is imagined as something that must be mediated by authorized keepers, the possibility emerges that access itself can become hierarchical. Not everyone hears the same story in the same way. Not everyone touches the archive. Not everyone interprets the signs. The temple does not merely stand between people and the gods. It stands between the present and the past. Later ages would often accuse priests, scribes, or religious elites of withholding dangerous truths. Sometimes such accusations are exaggerated by resentment or fantasy. But the suspicion itself is ancient because the structure is ancient. Wherever a class of trained custodians arises around sacred knowledge, the line between guardianship and control becomes difficult to draw clearly. In Mesopotamia, the first urban civilizations may not have hidden their past through some single deliberate conspiracy. The process was likely slower, more organic, more deeply woven into necessity. But necessity can still conceal. The need to stabilize ritual, centralize offerings, coordinate labor, and define legitimate tradition may have produced a world in which only certain versions of antiquity could survive respectably. So the old temple courts begin to gather in the imagination. Incense drifting upward, reed baskets carried across worn thresholds, priests reciting words already old when their grandfathers first learned them, clay tablets drying in rooms where the god's property and the city's memory become difficult to separate. The sanctuary glows as a refuge against disorder, and perhaps it truly was. Yet every refuge has walls, and walls do more than protect. They divide what is admitted from what remains outside. and as the sacred keepers of continuity stand watch at the earliest gates of history, another unease rises almost soundlessly from beneath the floor. If the temple taught the city how to remember, it may also have taught it something even more enduring: how to hide forgetting beneath the appearance of devotion. Once a civilization learns how to speak to the future, it also learns how to choose what the future will hear. This is the quieter revelation waiting beneath the miracle of writing. The first marks pressed into clay in ancient Mesopotamia are often celebrated with understandable awe, as though humanity had finally discovered a way to rescue thought from the frailty of breath. And perhaps that is true, but rescue is never pure. The hand that preserves is also the hand that selects. The tablet remembers, yet it remembers in a shape given to it by power, habit, necessity, and fear. So when writing begins to emerge in the temple and the storehouse, in the administrative courtyard and the managed precinct, something larger than literacy enters the world. A gate is built between experience and permanence. The earlier stages of Mesopotamian writing did not arrive draped in poetry. They seem, in their practical infancy, to have grown out of counting, categorizing, and controlling movement. Tokens, tallies, numerical notations, pictographic signs. These were tools before they were literature. They tracked grain, labour, livestock, deliveries, obligations. A city that had grown too large for memory alone needed external anchors. Spoken trust was no longer enough. The clay tablet became a second mind for institutions, a surface on which transactions could outlive the moment of exchange. This is often told as a triumph of complexity, and it was. Yet complexity has its own appetite. The world, once written, begins to prefer what can be written. What cannot be easily fixed in sign starts to lose status. That shift may have been more consequential than any early scribe could have imagined. Before writing, memory lives in bodies, rituals, repeated stories, skilled gestures, kinship lines, songs, and sacred places. It is fluid, vulnerable, and communal. Once writing enters the city, memory begins to stratify. Some knowledge remains oral, but the written record acquires a new gravity. The official tablet does not merely store information, it authorizes it. A ration exists because it is entered. A debt exists because it is marked. A boundary exists because it is inscribed. Over time, this does not simply make administration easier, it rearranges the structure of truth itself. What is unwritten may still be real, but it becomes easier to dismiss, harder to defend, less protected against the confidence of the archive. Here, the first shadow of concealment deepens. Writing is so often imagined as the enemy of forgetting that one can miss its subtler role in organizing forgetting more efficiently. Once a civilization can record selectively, omission becomes stronger than silence alone. A village story never written onto clay does not disappear at once, but it enters the future weakened. A defeated lineage absent from the archive begins to blur faster than one repeated in royal or temple texts. A local god not incorporated into official cult practice may linger in household ritual, yet lose the dignity of broad recognition. The tablet does not need to denounce every rival memory. It only needs to remain still while time does the rest. And time, in Mesopotamia, often served the written over the spoken in strangely durable ways. Clay, once baked intentionally or by accident in fire, could survive where organic materials failed. This is one reason the region speaks to modernity with such rare intensity. Its archives endured in fragments under ash, collapsed mud brick and desert soil, but survival can create illusion. Because tablets remain, one may be tempted to think the written world was the whole world. It was not. What survives archaeologically is not identical to what mattered emotionally or spiritually to everyone alive. The archive is a corridor through the past, not the full landscape. Yet civilizations built around writing often come to believe, at least institutionally, that what is not stabilized in record lies closer to uncertainty. That belief can narrow the past long before excavators arrive. The scribes themselves stand at the center of this transformation like careful intermediaries between sound and stone. Their training was demanding. Signs had to be learned, conventions mastered, formulas remembered. This alone created hierarchy. Writing was not a universal field into which anyone could step. It belonged to specialists, often tied to temples, palaces, or elite households. The scribe was more than a technician. He was a guardian of access. Through his hands, spoken command became permanent instruction. Observed event became usable record. Inherited myth became transmissible text. Such a role does not automatically make him a censor, yet it does place him inside a structure where mediation becomes power. The one who writes is rarely neutral toward what deserves inscription, and when mythology, ritual, kingship, and administration begin to flow through the same written channels, the authority of the script deepens even further. Hymns to gods, omen literature, royal inscriptions, lexical lists, legal decisions, scholarly compilations, all these emerge over time within cultures that had already learned to trust signs on clay as carriers of sanctioned order. A royal inscription praising a king's piety and victory is not merely boast, it is a challenge to future contradiction. A copied myth is not merely preservation, it is stabilization. A lexical list mapping words and categories is not merely educational, it is a subtle attempt to arrange the world into named compartments. Writing does not just mirror civilization, it participates in constructing the civilization's mental architecture. Perhaps this is why ancient writing often carries a paradoxical emotional charge. It feels revelatory, because it opens a door into vanished minds. Yet the deeper one listens, the more one senses the door is narrow. The surviving texts speak with astonishing intelligence, but also with institutional accent, even when personal voices appear in laments, prayers, wisdom literature, letters. The broader system around them remains one in which preservation favours certain centres of gravity. Temples, palaces, official schools, scribal traditions, these are the chambers from which most durable speech emerges. Ordinary life echoes around their edges, but seldom on equal terms. The first civilizations did not need to invent propaganda in its modern bluntness. They only needed durable media tied to durable institutions. The rest would happen slowly, almost naturally. This does not diminish the grandeur of writing. It makes it more human, and perhaps more haunting. For every tablet that preserves a contract, a prayer, or a king's triumph, there may have been countless spoken understandings, songs, disputes, and fears that vanished with the mouths that carried them. Civilizations built on writing often appear more solid than those without it, but that solidity is purchased through filtration. Writing sharpens memory by narrowing it. It preserves detail by ignoring abundance. It grants continuity at the price of invisible exclusions. The miracle and the wound are intertwined so tightly that separating them becomes impossible. There is another detail that lingers in the background like a dim lamp in a long corridor. Some Mesopotamian traditions imagined wisdom itself as ancient, even pre-human in feel, transmitted from divine realms, from Apkallu figures, from sacred origins beyond the ordinary city. Yet once that wisdom entered text, it entered guardianship. A secret written down is no longer wild. It belongs to a system of copying, interpretation, and control. That may be why writing has always carried a strange double aura. Revelation for the initiated, opacity for everyone else. The sign opens meaning, but only if one has been trained to read the gate. Otherwise it remains a wall covered in deliberate marks. So the listener begins to see the tablet differently, no longer as a simple vessel of truth, but as a threshold where truth is shaped, thinned, arranged, and made official. Wet clay receives the reed stylus. Columns form, numbers settle into order, names are fixed, gods are praised, deliveries are confirmed, victories are declared, and all the while, just beyond the visible signs, another history hovers in unwritten air. Older stories never selected, local meanings never standardized, memories too unstable or inconvenient to deserve a permanent place. The first civilizations discovered that to write is to outlast the moment. But they also discovered, perhaps very early, that to write is to decide which silences future generations will mistake for emptiness. And once that possibility exists, the mystery darkens. For if writing became the first great gatekeeper of memory, then how much of the ancient world was lost not because no one knew it, but because no one in power chose to press it into clay? Even in the oldest written worlds, most lives pass through history like breath on cold air. They are felt for a moment, then gone. The archives of early Mesopotamia seem abundant when viewed from afar, yet the closer one leans toward them, the more clearly their silence begins to divide itself. Kings speak, priests speak, administrators speak, temples and palaces through their scribes speak with astonishing endurance, but the people who carried bricks, cleared canals, ground grain, buried children, feared the river, or whispered older stories at night remain largely outside the light. And once that absence is noticed, it becomes difficult to ignore another question pressing quietly behind it. Was the first civilization truly hidden from posterity by time alone? Or did it begin by hiding most of itself from the very start? This is not an accusation in the modern moral sense. Every archive, even now, is selective. Records favour those who possess reason, means, or authority to make records. Yet in early urban civilization, the imbalance was especially profound because writing itself remained restricted, institutional, and expensive in human effort. To preserve a voice in durable form required access to trained scribes, administrative relevance, ritual value, or political importance. A labourer exhausted after canal work, a mother mourning a child, an old villager recalling a local god no longer central to the city's rites. Such people did not usually enter the tablet record as subjects of interior life. They entered, if at all, as quantities, a ration issued, a name in a labour list, a number in a distribution account, a dependent attached to a household. A body transformed into category. There is something especially haunting about this transformation, because it happens in a civilization often praised for making humanity legible. It did make humanity legible, but unevenly. The temple and the palace needed to know how much grain existed, how many workers could be mobilized, how many animals were owed, how many offerings had been delivered. Administration creates clarity by reducing complexity into forms it can manage. The same process that gave the city continuity also reduced countless private worlds into abstractions. A worker may appear on a tablet, yet not appear as a self. A woman may be present in dowry texts, household records, priestly roles, hymns to goddesses, and legal disputes, yet much of female experience remains mediated through systems designed largely by male institutions. The ancient city remembers people the way a machine remembers its parts, accurately enough to function, but rarely with the fullness of how it felt to live inside those bodies. Perhaps that is why the earlier civilizations can leave behind such a strange emotional residue. They seem articulate and mute at once. One can read laws, hymns, royal inscriptions, even personal letters in later periods, and still feel that the deepest human texture of the society remains elsewhere. Not absent exactly, but pushed into side corridors of evidence. Archaeology helps a little. Worn thresholds, cooking vessels, spindle whorls, graves, trash pits, repaired walls, children's footprints in mud brick, skeletal stress markers, traces of diet, injury, disease. These things speak without words. They remind the listener that the world of the first cities was held together not only by kingship and ritual, but by ordinary repetition and private endurance. Still, even archaeology often arrives in fragments, and fragments invite interpretation rather than certainty. The missing voices remain missing, even when their hands become visible in the dust. One might ask whether this silence is merely unavoidable. After all, the poor and the ordinary have often left fewer records in every age. But the question darkens when one remembers that early civilization was not only preserving itself, it was defining what deserved preservation. That is a subtle but crucial difference. The institutions that governed writing, ritual, and public legitimacy were not neutral observers overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of human life. They were systems with priorities. Certain names mattered because they stabilized authority. Certain events mattered because they justified order. Certain myths mattered because they made the city feel cosmically anchored. The rest of life could continue without equal inscription. In that sense, what later generations call the past may already have been narrowed by design into something more ceremonial, more administrative, and less humanly complete than the world itself had ever been. The defeated vanish especially quickly. Rival city-states are remembered through triumphal framing. Conquered peoples are absorbed under new labels. Failed claimants disappear into hostile summary or simple omission. A lineage that did not survive in power may not survive in narrative either. This is one of the oldest laws of written civilization. Survival in memory often follows survival in authority. Even the Sumerian King List, with all its grandeur, compresses political complexity into a neat sequence. Local overlap, competing claims, and human mess are refined into procession. The result is elegant, but elegance can be a form of concealment. Disorder is not erased because it never existed. It is erased because continuity requires a cleaner surface. And then there are the gods at the edges, the small cults, the household rites, the local spirits perhaps never fully admitted into official prominence. Mesopotamian religion was layered, changing, and regionally textured. Great gods rose above the sacred skyline, yet beneath them must have endured countless smaller devotions, older customs, intimate gestures not entirely captured by state or temple theology. Some of these were absorbed. Some survived in transformed ways. Some were likely lost not through prohibition, but through the slow humiliations of prestige. Once a city standardizes its sacred language, what is local can begin to feel lesser, then old-fashioned, then invisible. Thus even spiritual memory can be thinned not by destruction, but by centralization. Women stand in a particularly complex relation to this silence. They are not absent from Mesopotamian history. Far from it. They appear as priestesses, workers, wives, daughters, property holders in some contexts, litigants, mourners, singers, queens, and symbols of divine and earthly power. Yet most surviving records still pass through institutional and male-mediated forms. Their presence is often visible without being fully audible. One sees their role, but not always their unguarded thought. The same is true for children, migrants, servants, enslaved persons, and the rural poor. Civilization counted them, used them, regulated them, and sometimes protected them. But it did not grant them equal permanence of voice. And when future ages inherit that archive, they inherit the inequality inside it as though it were simply nature. This is where the emotional meaning of concealment grows more intimate. The past is not only hidden in buried chambers, flood layers, and broken texts. It is hidden in the structure of what was considered recordable. A culture can leave behind thousands of documents and still obscure the majority of its own lived reality, not by lying outright, but by building memory around institutions rather than persons. The result is a world that appears orderly and intelligible, while remaining internally shadowed. The first civilization, so often described as humanity's awakening into history, may also have been the moment when vast portions of human experience first learned how to disappear behind categories that looked objective. Yet those lost presences are never entirely gone. They remain in the strain marks on skeletons, in houses rebuilt after fire, in mass labour behind monumental walls, in lullabies never written, in household amulets, in repairs made with cheaper materials, in neighbourhoods that archaeology reveals but texts do not dignify. They remain in the difference between what institutions say mattered and what people had to do every day simply to remain alive. If one listens carefully, the silence changes texture. It no longer feels empty. It feels crowded with those who sustained civilization without being allowed to define its memory of itself. So the city darkens toward evening once more. Officials seal tablets. Priests complete recitations. The temple precinct glows above the narrow streets. Somewhere below that official brightness, a woman tells a child an old story that will never be copied. A labourer sleeps with cracked hands after hauling mud brick for a wall whose inscription will praise someone else. A local shrine receives a private offering beyond the attention of the archive. None of this will vanish completely, and yet none of it will survive in equal dignity. That imbalance may be one of the oldest secrets of civilization. It did not simply teach humanity how to remember. It taught humanity how to let power speak for the whole. And once that lesson had settled into clay and ritual, another question began to breathe in the dark. If so many of the first city's people were hidden inside their own civilization, then who, in the next layer of the story, first learned how to transform half memory into divine instruction? When the missing voices of a civilization begin to gather in the imagination, they do not always return as ordinary human figures. Sometimes they reappear clothed in radiance, carrying tools, laws, rituals, and forbidden memory. This is one reason the oldest Mesopotamian traditions feel so difficult to hold in purely administrative terms. Beneath the ration tablets and temple inventories, beneath the dynastic formulas and carefully ordered lists, another current moves with older force. It speaks of beings who came before kings, before cities as later ages knew them, before the settled confidence of ordinary history. They are not presented as inventors in the modern sense. They are revealers, mediators, bringers of pattern. And in that role, they stand at the edge of one of the oldest and most persistent suspicions in human thought. That civilization did not fully create its wisdom, but inherited it from somewhere it can no longer clearly describe. In Mesopotamian tradition, that inheritance often takes symbolic form through the apkallu, the ancient sages associated with primordial wisdom, sacred order, and the transmission of civilization. In later texts, especially from Assyrian and Babylonian scholarly traditions, these figures appear linked to the time before the flood and to divine instruction. Some are imagined with fish-like attributes, recalling the sea, the abyss, the deep reservoir of hidden knowledge associated with the god Enki, known later as Ea. The image is difficult to forget, a being emerging from the waters, not to conquer the human world, but to instruct it. He brings craft, ritual, law, measurement, understanding. In one of the best-known later formulations, the figure often identified by Greek writers as Uruk rises from the Persian Gulf by day and teaches humanity the arts of civilization. By night, he returns to the sea. No responsible reading requires this to be treated as literal visitation. The symbolic structure is already powerful enough without forcing it into modern fantasy. Water in Mesopotamian thought was never only water. It was depth, origin, danger, fertility, secrecy, and the hidden storehouse of forms. To say wisdom came from the deep was to place civilization's beginnings not in transparent human invention, but in a realm older and more mysterious than the city itself. The temple could organize that wisdom. The king could claim to preserve it. The scribe could copy it. But none of them could honestly pretend to have originated it. That admission, quiet as it is, matters. It suggests that the earliest civilizations did not see themselves as masters standing at absolute beginning. They saw themselves as recipients of a pattern that already existed beyond them. This is where modern fascination often intensifies and sometimes distorts. Later interpreters, especially in speculative and fringe traditions, have treated the apkallu, owans, and similar figures as encoded memories of advanced outsiders, lost antediluvian teachers, or even non-human visitors. Such interpretations move far beyond what mainstream scholarship can affirm, and yet the reason they endure is not difficult to understand. The source material itself already speaks in the language of interruption and inheritance. Civilizing knowledge arrives from beyond the ordinary human field. It is mediated by unusual beings. It precedes surviving institutions. It belongs, at least partly, to a world before the flood. Once those elements are present, suspicion naturally grows in the empty spaces between textual caution and imaginative hunger. Still, the deeper significance may not lie in whether such beings were literal, but in why a civilization needed to imagine wisdom this way. Perhaps the idea of knowledge descending from divine or semi-divine figures served to legitimize the order later built upon it. If law, ritual, temple procedure, and sacred measurement come from primordial sages, then they are not negotiable inventions. They are inheritances. That makes them stronger. It also makes them less vulnerable to challenge. Human institutions become custodians rather than creators, which allows them to govern in the name of something more ancient than politics. In that sense, myth does not conceal truth by replacing it. It protects authority by placing the origin of truth beyond ordinary access. But there is another possibility, quieter and more unsettling. The Apkallu and related traditions may preserve, in stylized form, the memory of real cultural transmission whose details had already grown dim. Human societies do not develop in sealed containers. They learn from neighbours, absorb techniques, inherit old sacred sites, revise symbols, and fold earlier populations into later systems. What later myth renders as a sage from the deep may sometimes reflect the after-image of forgotten teachers, displaced priesthoods, absorbed cultures, or bodies of knowledge whose true path through history had become too fragmented to narrate plainly. Over time, uncertainty itself acquires sacred costume. What cannot be traced is elevated. What cannot be fully explained becomes primordial. Ancient Mesopotamia was especially fertile ground for this kind of memory, because its civilizations were layered over older settlements, older cult centers, older material worlds. Sacred places preceded the political orders that later claimed them. Ritual habits almost certainly outlived the languages in which they were first spoken. Symbols changed meaning while retaining form. A later city may have genuinely felt that it had inherited procedures of great antiquity without knowing exactly from whom. In such a world, divine sages become a coherent solution to historical opacity. They allow continuity to remain sacred even when continuity is no longer historically transparent. The association with Enki deepens this mystery. Enki is no simple sky god of distance and decree. He belongs to the subterranean waters, to cunning, craft, hidden wisdom, the shaping intelligence that works beneath surfaces. He is often the god who warns, who preserves, who knows how to move around catastrophe rather than merely condemn it. That such a deity would stand near traditions of civilization's transmission is revealing. The first knowledge is not presented as public spectacle. It rises from beneath, from the concealed place, from a depth that cannot be fully domesticated by the visible order above. The city may build temples in honor of this wisdom, but its source remains symbolically below the city, below the brick, below the record. Perhaps this is why the civilizing sage is such a durable image across cultures in one form or another. Human beings seem reluctant to believe that the deepest structures of order were simply improvised in broad daylight. We imagine mentors, revealers, lawgivers, sacred intermediaries. This is not always evidence of historical suppression. Sometimes it is the mind's way of expressing gratitude toward what it cannot reconstruct. Yet in Mesopotamia, where flood, fragmentation, and institutional curation already complicate the past, such figures take on a sharper resonance. They begin to look like guardians standing at the broken bridge between remembered history and the darkness before it. The later scholarly traditions that compiled and copied these materials were not naive. They lived in highly literate, reflective cultures capable of classification, commentary, and celestial observation. If they preserved primordial sages, it was not because they lacked the capacity for analysis. It was because the category served a deep civilizational function. It explained why wisdom felt old, why legitimacy required depth, why ritual and kingship needed roots beyond argument. In preserving these figures, the scholars preserved a confession the official order could never entirely erase, that the city knew itself to be downstream from something it did not wholly possess. So the ancient shoreline returns in the mind. Dawn breaks over the gulf, or over the remembered image of it. A figure rises from the waters carrying no weapon, only instruction. People gather, fields, measures, rites, names, buildings, boundaries, offerings, stars, all begin to arrange themselves around a pattern that feels both intimate and foreign. Whether this happened in history as event is almost beside the point. It happened in memory as necessity. Civilization wanted its foundations to be older than any throne. It wanted knowledge to arrive with the gravity of revelation, not the vulnerability of experiment. Yet that desire leaves a faint and lingering ache. For when a culture says its deepest wisdom came from beings before the flood, from the sea, from the hidden realm, it may also be admitting something it cannot say directly, that the true origin of its order was already slipping beyond reach. And if that origin had to be entrusted to sages who were no longer fully human, then perhaps the next secret lies not in who taught the first cities, but in what was buried when later cities rebuilt their sacred ground above the vanished schools of the dead. The oldest cities rarely vanish in a single gesture. More often they sink slowly beneath the weight of those who continue living above them. Brick settles into dust, courtyards fill with debris, walls collapse and are levelled, and then new foundations are laid as if continuity itself required burial. This is one of the quietest and most unsettling truths archaeology has given to the modern mind. The ruins of the first civilization are not usually solitary, they are layered. Temple above temple, house above house, street above street. A city preserved not in one moment, but in stacked acts of forgetting. And once this is seen clearly, another unease begins to rise from the earth itself. Perhaps the first civilizations did not only lose their past through catastrophe or conquest, perhaps they concealed it simply by surviving. The Mesopotamian tell is one of history's most patient symbols. From a distance, it can look like an ordinary mound, shaped by wind and weather into an unremarkable swelling of earth. But beneath that surface lies compressed time, ash, pottery, broken seals, wall lines, ovens, bones, drains, thresholds, plaster, fill, repairs, abandonment, return. Each layer marks a life once treated as present. Each became foundation for the next. Archaeology, with its trenches and section drawings, moves downward through these layers as if descending through memory itself. Yet the descent is never clean. Later occupation cuts into earlier levels. Sacred spaces are renewed while the meanings around them shift. Rubbish becomes building material. Reverence and erasure work side by side. To live in an ancient city was often to inherit the dead without fully seeing them. This is especially true of temples. In southern Mesopotamia, sacred sites were rebuilt over extraordinary spans of time, so consistently that continuity itself became architectural doctrine. At Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, and elsewhere, old sanctuaries gave way to new ones placed on the same sacred ground. The impulse behind this is easy to understand. Holy places accumulate gravity. Once a location becomes bound to divine presence, abandoning it can feel unthinkable. Rebuilding affirms loyalty. It tells the community that the bond endures despite flood, fire, political change, or the wearing down of mud brick by rain and season. But the form of that loyalty matters. Each new sanctuary honours the old by covering it. What is preserved is not transparency but lineage. The past survives as substructure, hidden and weight-bearing, while the visible world belongs to the present order. That is a profoundly civilizational gesture. It allows a culture to claim antiquity without leaving itself fully exposed to antiquity's disorder. The earlier shrine remains present enough to sanctify the new one, yet absent enough not to challenge it in its original voice. The older foundation becomes a guarantee rather than an argument. That distinction changes everything. It means the city does not need to destroy the past in order to master it. It only needs to place the past underneath. Burial becomes reverence. Concealment becomes continuity. And once a civilization learns this architectural language, it can practice it across every domain of memory. The houses of ordinary people reveal the same principle in humbler form. Domestic structures were built, repaired, abandoned, partially levelled, and built over again. Streets rose because debris accumulated. Floors were renewed, walls were patched. The city literally climbed upon its own exhaustion. Here concealment was not ideological in any simple way. It was practical. Yet practicality can produce historical blindness as effectively as deliberate suppression. The child growing up in a rebuilt house does not experience the older room beneath the floor as a lost world. It is simply ground. The dead settle into infrastructure. Over generations, this becomes one of the most powerful mechanisms of forgetting imaginable. The past does not disappear because it is denied. It disappears because it remains too close, too constant, too built into the present to be recognized as separate. This may be why archaeology so often feels like an encounter with something history itself had normalized into invisibility. The excavator peels back the calm surface of accumulated certainty and discovers that what looked singular was plural all along. One temple was several temples. One city was many cities wearing the same name. One sacred center held centuries of change beneath its claim to permanence. This is not a refutation of continuity, but a complication of it. Continuity in early civilization was real, yet it was achieved through repeated acts of replacement, and replacement, however respectful, can still distort inheritance. A later priest may sincerely believe he serves the same god in the same house as his ancestors, while standing above ritual worlds whose precise forms he no longer knows. There is something almost philosophical in this arrangement. Human beings long for permanence, but they can only build it through materials that decay and meanings that shift. So they solve the problem by layering. They create the appearance of endurance through successive substitution. The name remains, the sacred place remains, the claim of legitimacy remains, but the substance changes. One could call this the normal process of civilization, and perhaps it is. Yet it also means that the first cities may have learned very early how to transform rupture into tradition. A break in material continuity need not be admitted as a break if it can be sealed beneath a new floor and blessed as renewal. Such layering helps explain why origin stories feel so unstable. When a city has rebuilt its center many times, which version counts as the true beginning? The first shrine of reeds or packed earth? The first mud brick platform? The first monumental phase visible to later memory? The answer depends on who is speaking and why. Institutions tend to prefer beginnings that justify their current form. Archaeology prefers deeper beginnings, though even depth can mislead if one mistakes surviving layer for absolute origin. Beneath one known foundation there may be another. Beneath the earliest visible order there may have been less formal gatherings, shrines, territorial markers, seasonal rites, or borrowed traditions no wall now preserves. The farther down one goes, the more origin dissolves into prehistory, and the more tempting it becomes for later cultures to cover uncertainty with sacred narrative. This is one reason the first civilization can seem to hide its past even from itself. By rebuilding, it protected what mattered while also losing access to earlier arrangements. By maintaining sacred sites, it ensured continuity while narrowing what continuity meant. By inhabiting the same place over centuries, it made depth physically real but experientially inaccessible. The result is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, but something older and perhaps more human, a civilization that could not go on living unless it treated buried complexity as stable ground. Every society does some version of this. Mesopotamia merely reveals it with unusual clarity because its earth remembers in layers. Later conquerors would inherit these layered cities and add their own surfaces. Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, each stood on older ground, sometimes literally, sometimes intellectually, claiming antiquity through sites whose original context had already begun to blur. This sacred mound becomes a kind of machine for producing legitimacy. Rule feels older if it occupies an old place. Worship feels truer if it rises from an ancient base. Yet every new layer increases the distance between visible meaning and buried origin. The city remains alive by making its own memory more difficult to recover. So the ancient mound waits in the half-light, looking mute from above while holding entire civilizations in compressed silence below. A temple platform catches the last of the sun. Beneath it lie older walls, older offerings, older footsteps worn into vanished thresholds. Beneath the street, forgotten rooms. Beneath the room, another city's ash. No single generation intended all this as deception, and yet the effect is nearly indistinguishable from it. The past is there, intact in fragments, but sealed under devotion, necessity, and the ordinary will to continue. And as the mind descends through these buried floors, one question takes on heavier weight than before. If every civilization survives by building over what came earlier, then when later empires arrived and claimed the memory of the land for themselves, what else did they inherit besides ruins? And what, in the act of inheritance, did they decide should never rise back to the surface? A civilization does not always end when its walls fall. Sometimes it ends much earlier, in the soil, in the water, in the slow exhaustion of systems that once seemed permanent. By the time collapse becomes visible in the historical record, through abandoned cities, broken dynasties, empty storehouses, and the language of lament, the deeper unravelling may have been underway for generations. This is what gives the question of Mesopotamia's fractures such a lingering unease. Was the first civilization broken by one decisive catastrophe, or by a series of pressures so gradual that later memory could only compress them into flood, judgment, or the mysterious withdrawal of favour? And if it was a slow undoing, who would have been able to see it clearly enough to name it while it was happening? The southern alluvium was generous, but never without conditions. Irrigation made urban life possible, yet irrigation in fragile environments carries its own shadow. Water that nourishes can also leave salt behind. Over long spans of time, poorly managed or unavoidable salinization can reduce yields, alter crop choices, and strain the agricultural basis on which temple and palace systems depend. Scholars have long pointed to evidence that parts of southern Mesopotamia experienced just such problems. Barley, more salt-tolerant than wheat, appears increasingly prominent in some periods. Productivity may have declined in zones forced to endure the slow chemistry of human success. This is not the kind of disaster that announces itself dramatically. It is quieter. The field still looks like a field. The canal still carries water. Yet the future has already begun withdrawing from the soil. At the same time, rivers refuse stillness. Channels shifted. Harbours became less useful. Trade routes adapted. Settlements that once sat beside vital arteries could find themselves stranded by the very landscape that had elevated them. In such a world, urban greatness was never fully secure. A city might seem eternal, while depending on hydrological arrangements that were anything but fixed. When modern readers see a ruin and ask what destroyed it, they often imagine armies or flames, but the oldest cities were just as vulnerable to the indifference of geomorphology. A river moving a few miles can wound a civilization more quietly and perhaps more thoroughly than a siege. Then there were the pressures human beings imposed on one another, competition among city-states, shifting alliances, raids, conquest, dynastic ambition. These were not interruptions to Mesopotamian civilization. They were woven into its life. The same administrative sophistication that made large urban systems possible also made extraction possible on a greater scale. Labour could be mobilized, taxed, redirected, exhausted. Surplus could be claimed in the name of gods and kings. As centres grew in wealth and complexity, so did the fragility of the populations that sustained them. One bad harvest, one military campaign, one interruption of canal maintenance, one political dispute strong enough to fracture distribution networks. Each could expose how narrow the margin between splendour and strain had always been. This is why the language of reset can feel so tempting when thinking about the ancient Near East. Not because there is evidence for some single hidden mechanism that periodically erased civilization from above, but because the system itself seems to have contained the seeds of repeated breakdown. Every layer of order required maintenance. Every maintenance system required legitimacy. Every legitimacy structure depended on surplus and ritual continuity. Once enough of those elements slipped out of alignment, collapse could begin without fanfare. The city would still stand for a while. Priests would still recite. Scribes would still record. Kings would still issue inscriptions in the language of strength. But underneath, the load-bearing relations might already be failing. The Akkadian collapse often enters this conversation like a dark wind from the north. Later than the earliest Sumerian florescence, yet deeply relevant to its legacy, the Akkadian Empire shows how vulnerable even large-scale integration could be. Archaeological and paleoclimatic studies have suggested that episodes of aridity may have contributed to regional stress during the late 3rd millennium BCE, though scholars continue to debate timing, scale, and local variation. Here again, the pattern matters more than any single explanation. Climate does not act alone. Drought, if present, intensifies social weakness. Migration pressures rise. Agricultural foundations strain. Political centres demand more as they become less able to guarantee stability. The resulting crisis can look, from within lived experience, like divine abandonment. From outside, it looks like a convergence no state could fully absorb. Yet collapse is never evenly distributed. Some cities decline while others adapt. Some sacred centres lose prominence while neighbouring regions reorganise. The notion of a total civilizational death can therefore mislead. Mesopotamia was not a machine that switched off once and for all. It was a field of repeating ruptures, recoveries, transformations and absorptions. That may be even more disturbing. A single catastrophe is easier to imagine than a world in which breakdown becomes cyclical, almost structural. If so, what later texts present as flood, divine anger, or the end of an age may sometimes encode not one event, but a collective intuition that order itself had become recurrently unstable. This is where the possibility of deliberate concealment re-enters the room, not as melodrama, but as institutional survival. When systems falter, ruling structures rarely describe the failure in fully material terms. Temples do not ordinarily announce that the fields are exhausted because decades of management have reached their ecological limit. Kings do not inscribe that authority is weakening because the social bargain beneath taxation and labour extraction has frayed beyond repair. Instead, crisis is narrated through the languages available to legitimacy, moral disorder, divine displeasure, foreign threat, ritual failure, broken oaths. These are not false in the minds of those who use them. They are the conceptual tools of the age, but they also redirect attention. They frame collapse in ways that preserve the dignity of the institutions most implicated in it. In that sense, the first civilizations may have hidden the mechanics of their own decline simply by interpreting them through sacred and political idioms strong enough to obscure structural truth. The people living through such eras may have genuinely believed what the texts say, yet belief can still conceal. A famine explained as divine anger does not become unreal because ecological stress helped produce it. A military defeat described as ritual failure does not stop being tied to administrative weakness. Myth and ideology do not erase material causes. They absorb them into stories capable of protecting meaning when the system is least able to endure naked scrutiny. There is something almost tender in this, and tragic too. Human beings living inside failing worlds rarely want a diagram. They want coherence. They want to know why suffering has entered the city, why canals go uncleared, why grain thins, why enemies gather, why the gods seem far away. The official explanation, whatever its form, offers a way to remain spiritually intact while the material order shifts beneath their feet. But for future generations, that coherence becomes a veil. The ruins are left behind. The lament survives. The curse formula survives. The inscription praising restoration survives. What is harder to recover is the exact texture of the slow unmaking itself, so perhaps the idea of a civilizational reset should be handled carefully, neither worshipped nor dismissed too quickly. It need not mean a fantastical wiping clean of all human memory. It can mean something subtler and historically grounded, a rupture deep enough that later order must rebuild on terms that conceal how fragile the old order had become. A reset occurs when institutions survive by changing the story of what happened, when recovery depends on narrowing memory, when sacred continuity is emphasized precisely because material continuity has failed. In such moments, civilization preserves itself by becoming less honest about its own brokenness. The plain darkens again. Salt whitens the edges of neglected fields. A canal runs shallow where it once held authority in liquid form. In the temple, the lamps are lit as though nothing fundamental has changed. Somewhere in the palace, a scribe writes in careful lines about offerings, omens, repairs, troop movements, grain. The script remains orderly. The city still speaks. Yet outside the text, the system is learning how to come apart while still wearing the costume of permanence, and perhaps that is the deepest form of concealment yet encountered in this journey. Not the hiding of a glorious lost age, but the hiding of fragility itself. For once, the first civilization learned to mask its own exhaustion in the language of destiny. Another force was already approaching from beyond its walls, the conqueror who would inherit not only its cities, but its methods of remembering. When a civilization weakens, it does not surrender its memory all at once. More often, memory is inherited before it is understood. The conqueror arrives in armor, but soon finds himself walking through old temple courts, handling older names, standing before gods who were already ancient when his own language was still young. This is one of the strangest patterns in the history of Mesopotamia. Those who took power over the land rarely erased everything that came before. They borrowed, translated, elevated, renamed, and reordered. And in doing so, they became something more than victors. They became editors of antiquity, which means the next veil over the first civilization may not have been laid by collapse alone, but by the careful hands of those who inherited its ruins and decided which parts of its past were useful enough to keep alive. The Akkadians provide one of the earliest and most revealing examples of this transformation. Sargon of Akkad and the dynasty that followed did not emerge from a vacuum. They rose in a world already shaped by Sumerian city-states, temple economies, sacred geographies, and administrative habits. What they built was new in scale and ambition, yet it rested on earlier foundations. The Akkadian language entered prominence, but Sumerian did not vanish. Administrative forms endured. Divine names travelled across linguistic boundaries. Ritual structures survived by adaptation. This is not simple replacement. It is conquest braided with continuity. The older civilization remains visible, but no longer on its own terms. It is filtered through the priorities of the power that now speaks in its name. That filtering matters because inheritance always changes what is inherited. A conqueror may preserve a temple because it legitimizes his rule, but preservation under new authority is never transparent. The temple now speaks a second language. Its rituals may continue, yet their meaning shifts as they are folded into broader political visions. The same is true of texts. A hymn copied in a later age survives, but survives inside a school, a court, or a scholarly lineage shaped by later needs. Nothing remains untouched by the conditions of its preservation. And because Mesopotamian civilization endured through such repeated acts of reuse, the surviving image of its beginnings becomes increasingly layered, increasingly mediated, increasingly difficult to distinguish from the intentions of those who came after. The Babylonians understood this art of inheritance with extraordinary subtlety. Babylon itself rose to greatness long after the earlier Sumerian cities had already entered the deep past. Yet it did not present itself as alien to that past. It absorbed it. Sumerian remained a learned and sacred language long after it ceased to function as a living vernacular. That fact alone is profoundly revealing. A dead language was preserved because antiquity had become a source of authority. To write in Sumerian, to study old lexical lists, to maintain old hymnic traditions, to invoke ancient wisdom. These were not merely antiquarian habits. They were methods of participating in legitimacy older than Babylon itself. But every sacred language preserved by scholarship also becomes a curated language. It survives inside schools, commentaries, and formal use. It is honoured, yet controlled. Reverence and domestication become indistinguishable. This is why one must be careful with the word preservation. Later, Mesopotamian cultures preserved astonishing amounts of earlier material, far more than many civilizations managed. Yet preservation is never the same as access. An old text copied in a later scriptoria does not arrive before us unfiltered. Its manuscript history matters. Its selection matters. The context in which it was studied matters. A world can preserve the shell of antiquity while quietly rewriting the relation future generations will have to it. The first civilization may survive, but as canon rather than as open memory. It becomes something to be learned, cited, revered, and politically mobilized, not something allowed to remain wild. The Assyrians, so often remembered for imperial power and military severity, participated in this editorial inheritance with their own intensity. Their royal inscriptions thunder of conquest, but their scholars collected, copied, organized, and classified earlier knowledge with almost obsessive devotion. The Library of Ashurbanipal stands as one of history's most haunting monuments, not because it created Mesopotamian wisdom, but because it gathered so much of it into imperial custody. Myths, omens, lexical texts, rituals, prayers, epics, all could be housed within the apparatus of a king who sought not only dominion over land, but possession of civilization's memory. The archive becomes empire in another form. To collect the old world is to govern its afterlife. And yet even this devotion conceals as much as it reveals. A library is not the whole world. It is a shaped world. Ashurbanipal's scholars chose what to copy, what to classify, what to preserve under royal authority. Some texts survive because they served scholarly, ritual, or political purpose. Others vanished because no institution carried them forward. The imperial archive is magnificent, but its magnificence can hide the violence of selection. When a later civilization becomes custodian of an earlier one, it often turns memory into possession. The past remains alive, but not free. Persian rule introduced another variation on this pattern. The Achaemenid Empire did not erase the deeply Mesopotamian character of the land it governed. Temples continued. Local elites remained significant. Administrative continuity mingled with imperial oversight. This, too, is a form of concealment through accommodation. When a larger empire allows old forms to remain, it can appear respectful, even gentle by the standards of antiquity. Yet old forms under imperial canopy still shift in meaning. A city that once imagined itself as the centre of the world becomes one province among many. Its gods survive, but in a geopolitical reality no longer their own. Memory continues, but proportion changes. What once felt foundational may now be curated as regional antiquity within a broader order. Then come the Greeks, and with them another transformation of gaze. The old Near Eastern world enters new languages, new systems of description, new habits of comparison. Figures like Berossus, writing in the Hellenistic era, become especially important because they transmit Mesopotamian traditions through forms legible to Greek readers. This is preservation again, but also translation in the deepest sense. When Oannes enters Greek discourse, when King Lists and flood memories are reframed for a different intellectual audience, the first civilization survives by becoming interpretable to outsiders. Something is gained in this crossing, something is also thinned. Translation can save memory from isolation, but it can also detach myth from ritual setting, history from sacred geography, and inherited meaning from the institutions that once held it in place. At each stage, the same pattern returns with slight variation. Conquest does not simply destroy, it appropriates. It selects what can confer depth and authority on the present regime. The first civilization becomes an ancestral reservoir, but one that later powers dip into strategically. Ancient kingship, sacred language, temple prestige, flood traditions, wisdom literature, astral knowledge, all can be kept alive because they remain useful. The danger lies in mistaking usefulness for honesty. What survives is often what later systems could integrate. What resists integration is more likely to fall into shadow. Thus the past narrows while appearing to endure. This helps explain why Mesopotamia feels so simultaneously near and unreachable. It is not merely buried under sand, it is buried under acts of remembrance performed by others. Each inheriting empire laid a new interpretive floor above the old one. The result is a past preserved through mediation, visible through inherited filters. Even the modern mind, reading ancient texts in translation, often encounters Sumer not directly, but through Akkadian copies, Babylonian scholarship, Assyrian collections, Greek reframings, and later archaeological reconstructions. The first civilization reaches us as an echo through many halls, so the conqueror stands at last inside the old sanctuary, no longer merely a destroyer. He orders repairs, he commissions inscriptions, he speaks of restoring what former ages honoured. Priests continue their rites beneath new political skies, scribes copy older words into later tablets. The city appears continuous, perhaps even eternal. But continuity has become a mask worn by succession. The land remembers, yet it remembers under supervision. And as empire after empire inherits the right to define what antiquity means, another question drifts forward with almost unbearable quiet. If every new ruler preserved the past only by translating it into the language of present power, then by the time sacred history itself was reborn under later religious worlds, how much of the first civilization still remained visible, and how much had already been made too dangerous, too foreign, or too sacred to be remembered plainly? There comes a point in the life of every old civilization when its memory is no longer merely inherited, it is judged. The temples may still stand in fragments, the texts may still survive in archives, the names of gods may still echo in scholarly lists or foreign accounts, but the deeper question changes. No longer simply, what happened? It becomes, what may still be allowed to mean something. This is the threshold where sacred history turns dangerous. And for the civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia, whose myths, symbols, and cosmic structures once formed part of the intellectual ground of the Near East, that threshold may have been one of the most decisive veils of all. Not the loss caused by flood or war, not the editing done by kings or priests alone, but the later moral and theological worlds that could only preserve the old past by making it subordinate, distorted, or suspect. The ancient Mesopotamian imagination was full of powers that did not fit neatly into later systems of clean spiritual division. The gods were vast, but not always morally simple. Wisdom could come from the deep, from trickster intelligence, from beings that moved between realms. Sacred knowledge was entangled with divination, omen reading, celestial observation, ritual exactitude, and the old conviction that heaven and earth were mirrored in fragile relation. Such a worldview did not separate religion, nature, politics, and cosmic pattern into the categories later ages would prefer. It wove them together. That weaving gave the civilization its depth. It also made its memory difficult to inherit intact once new, religious and imperial frameworks demanded a different order of truth. One can already feel the tension in late antiquity. Mesopotamian traditions did not simply disappear when new empires and new religious forms rose around them. They lingered in symbols, calendrical habits, astral sciences, flood narratives, legal inheritances, and in the very structure of questions later cultures asked about creation, kingship, catastrophe, and the destiny of human beings. Yet lingering is not the same as surviving openly. When a new sacred order establishes itself, older cosmologies often face only a handful of possible futures. They may be absorbed and reinterpreted. They may be tolerated as antiquarian residue. They may be condemned as dangerous error, or they may survive in disguised fragments, their original setting forgotten while their shapes continue beneath new names. Flood traditions provide one of the clearest examples of this transformation. The Mesopotamian stories of Ziusudra, Atrahasis, and Utnapishtim did not vanish into silence. Their structures moved forward, profoundly reframed, into later scriptural traditions. But once absorbed into a new theological architecture, the old stories no longer belonged to the world that first carried them. Their meaning was narrowed into a different moral universe. What may once have been a layered cultural memory of river catastrophe, divine unpredictability, and civilizational rupture became, in later sacred hands, something more singularly disciplined. The flood remained, but its interpretive horizon changed. Preservation, once again, became inseparable from transformation. The same can be said of cosmic geography, angelic or intermediary beings, wisdom descending from above or below, and the persistent ancient belief that knowledge itself had once been nearer to the human world than it is now. These themes did not vanish from the Near Eastern imagination. They were recoded. Some were elevated into respectable theology. Others slipped toward heresy, occultism, or forbidden speculation. This is one of the quietest ways a civilization loses its past. The symbols remain visible, but their acceptable meanings are placed under supervision. The old imagination is not always erased. It is disciplined. That discipline becomes especially powerful when later religious systems define themselves partly against what came before. Once older ritual structures are recast as idolatry, once local gods become false gods, once ancient rites are stripped of legitimacy and remembered mainly as warnings, the first civilization enters a new kind of shadow. It survives in opposition. The very materials that once organized reality become examples of what truth must no longer be. The irony is difficult to miss. What is condemned is often preserved more fiercely than what is merely ignored. Polemics remember what neutrality forgets, but they remember it under hostile light. An old temple no longer appears as a center of cosmic reciprocity. It becomes proof of error. An older sacred image no longer reveals a world. It becomes evidence of blindness before the arrival of a truer order. This does not mean later monotheistic or imperial traditions acted with simple malice. History is more difficult than that. Every worldview organizes reality by distinguishing true from false, sacred from profane, legitimate from illegitimate. The new religious ages were not uniquely cruel in doing this. They were human. They inherited a crowded past and had to decide how that past could coexist with their own claims of revelation. Yet necessity can conceal as effectively as conquest. A truth that cannot be integrated must be domesticated. If it cannot be domesticated, it must be morally downgraded. And if it remains too alluring in its original form, then it may need to be surrounded by warnings. The older sciences suffered a similar fate of partial continuity. Mesopotamian astronomical observation, omen traditions, mathematical procedures, and calendrical refinements deeply influenced later worlds. But the interpretive atmosphere around them changed as they moved. Knowledge detached from the temples that once housed it could survive as technique while losing its cosmological body. A calculation remains, a star name remains, a cycle remains. Yet the sacred universe that once made such knowledge meaningful in a total sense becomes harder to recover. One inherits the instrument, not always the sky beneath which it was first considered holy. This too is a form of concealment, more elegant than destruction, and perhaps more complete. There is also the matter of fear. Old civilizations are most dangerous not when they are dead, but when they continue to suggest alternative arrangements of the world. Mesopotamia, even in ruin, carried that danger. It testified to kingship older than later empires, sacred traditions older than later scriptures, flood memories older than later theology, and sciences that complicated any simple account of civilization's beginning. To remember it too fully would be to admit that truth had once worn other names with equal seriousness. Many later systems could not comfortably allow that. So antiquity was granted prestige but not freedom. It could be ancient without being normative, admired without being authoritative, studied without being obeyed. This is perhaps why the first civilization eventually begins to look less like a vanished homeland and more like a sealed chamber beneath later faiths. Its stones remain underfoot, its stories move through inherited language, its symbols glimmer at the edge of later doctrine. Yet to approach it directly becomes difficult. One must pass through layers of moral reinterpretation, apologetic framing, and inherited suspicion. The old gods are not merely forgotten. They are remembered as things one must no longer trust. The old wisdom is not merely lost. It is often recast as incomplete at best, dangerous at worst. In that atmosphere, the past is not silent because no one preserved it. It is silent because its original voice has been made harder to hear without crossing lines later worlds preferred to police carefully. And still, fragments survive with stubborn grace. A flood, a garden of beginnings, a wisdom figure, a cosmic mountain, a descent into the underworld, a law from beyond man. A city under divine gaze. These motifs move like embers through centuries, refusing total extinction. They remind the listener that sacred memory, even when disciplined, is difficult to kill entirely. But embers are not the same as flame. By the time they reach later ages, they illuminate only pieces of the chamber they came from. So the old world waits again in half-darkness. Not destroyed now, but morally eclipsed. The temple is gone, yet its geometry lingers under newer sanctuaries. The old stories survive, yet in borrowed robes. The gods have been renamed false, the rites dissolved into warning, the wisdom translated into acceptable fragments. Everything appears preserved just enough to be controlled. And perhaps that is why this stage of concealment feels colder than the others. Flood at least leaves ruin, honestly. Empire admits succession. But sacred history, once disciplined by later truth, can bury the past while claiming to have fulfilled it, which leaves one more shadow moving toward the listener through the dust of modern centuries. If so much of the first civilization was filtered by later faith and empire, what happened when modern archaeology arrived promising recovery, and brought with it a new power to excavate, classify, own, and rearrange the dead? The modern age likes to imagine excavation as a form of rescue. Buried cities are uncovered, scripts are deciphered, forgotten kings return to language, and the silence of millennia seems for a moment to loosen its grip. There is truth in that image. Without archaeology, much of ancient Mesopotamia would still lie beneath mounds mistaken for weathered hills. Without philology, the wedge-shaped signs pressed into clay would remain visible and unreadable, like a mouth moving behind glass. And yet the modern recovery of the first civilization was never as innocent as discovery prefers to sound. The spade that uncovers can also disturb. The museum that preserves can also remove. The scholar who deciphers can also rearrange. So when the old land was opened again in the 19th and early 20th centuries, another veil descended even as older veils were lifted. The veil of modern possession. It began, as so many modern recoveries did, in a world shaped by empire. European powers moved through the Ottoman domains not only as diplomats and traders, but as collectors of antiquity, hunters of origins, and competitors in prestige. Ancient Mesopotamia entered the modern imagination through a convergence of curiosity, biblical interest, imperial ambition, and the hunger of museums for objects grand enough to anchor national narratives. Assyrian palaces, colossal winged bulls, cuneiform tablets, reliefs of kings and campaigns, all these became more than archaeological finds. They became trophies of knowledge. The ruins did not merely speak, they were made to speak inside imperial capitals, under glass, under labels, in languages not their own. There is something deeply revealing in that migration. A tablet lifted from Mesopotamian soil and placed in London, Paris, Berlin, or elsewhere is preserved. Yes, it is also severed. Its context narrows. The room it once occupied, the debris around it, the relation of one archive to another, the feel of landscape, climate, and sacred geography, much of that is weakened the moment the object becomes collectible. Archaeology has long struggled with this paradox. To save the fragment, one often must move it. But movement changes meaning. The first civilization, already filtered through kings, priests, empires, and later religions, now entered yet another system of ordering. The museum, the catalogue, the disciplinary archive of modern scholarship. At first, that scholarship was driven by extraordinary acts of decipherment. The reading of cuneiform in the 19th century remains one of the great intellectual recoveries in human history. Through painstaking comparison of inscriptions, multilingual texts, royal names, and repeated sign patterns, scholars gradually brought the old scripts back into intelligibility. It is hard not to feel wonder here. A sign pressed into clay 4,000 years ago once again becomes language. A king boasts, a scribe counts barley, a poet laments a city. A myth stirs after centuries of stillness. Yet even decipherment has its shadow. The first questions modern scholars asked were rarely neutral. They sought origins, chronologies, biblical correlations, imperial histories, and civilizational hierarchies legible to the intellectual worlds they already inhabited. Ancient Mesopotamia was not only recovered, it was fitted into modern schemes of significance. This fitting matters more than it first appears. The first civilization could be presented as cradle, source, prelude, ancestor, or primitive stage depending on the needs of the interpreter. One age admired it as the beginning of law and writing, another treated it as raw material for confirming scriptural narratives, another folded it into theories of racial development, civilizational progress, or the emergence of the state. None of these frameworks is entirely false in every respect. But frameworks are never transparent. They highlight some aspects and dim others. A civilization becomes easier to admire when it can be made to stand at the beginning of our history. Harder truths, the discontinuities, alternative sacred worlds, unresolved origins, the violence of empire, the selective nature of archives, can fade behind the satisfying glow of firstness. The excavation trench itself became a kind of modern scripture. Layers were recorded, objects numbered, bricks measured, inscriptions copied. There is rigour in this, and a noble one, but there is also selection. Early archaeology was not always patient by later standards. Monumental finds often received more attention than ordinary life. Palaces and temples captured the imagination more readily than kitchens, waste pits, irrigation traces, or the slow archaeology of labour. This is understandable. Grand things call loudly to the human eye. Yet the effect is familiar. Once again, civilization could be reconstructed through its elite surfaces more easily than through the full texture of its hidden majority. The modern world, even while criticising ancient power, sometimes repeated its habits of emphasis. Then there is the matter of destruction in the name of recovery. Archaeology does not simply reveal layers, it consumes them. To excavate is to destroy the original arrangement of what one uncovers, replacing it with notes, drawings, photographs, catalogues, and stored fragments. A trench cannot be closed without loss. That is why good archaeology is so careful. Yet in earlier phases of Mesopotamian exploration, care was not always what ambition most rewarded. Objects travelled faster than methods matured. Whole contexts were damaged or poorly recorded. The ancient world, having survived flood and empire, now faced another strange fate. It could be lost again while being saved. Modern political history added further complexity. The lands of ancient Mesopotamia did not lie outside history while Europeans excavated them. Iraq and the surrounding region passed through colonial mandates, nation-building, war, sanctions, looting, invasion, and cultural devastation. Museums were not immune. Sites were damaged. Tablets disappeared into illicit markets. The first civilization continued to be rearranged, not only in scholarly books, but by the violence of modern states and the economics of global antiquities. To speak of recovery without acknowledging this would be another form of concealment. The dead were not brought back into a peaceful world. They were brought into modernity's own storms, and yet, despite all this, archaeology truly did open an ancient wound in the best and hardest sense. It proved that old myths were tied to real cities. It expanded the depth of written history. It revealed that flood traditions, temple economies, king lists, law collections, and cosmological texts belonged to a world richer and older than many later narratives had admitted. It showed that the first civilization had not simply vanished into legend. Its clay, brick, and language remained recoverable, at least in fragments. But fragments require interpretation, and interpretation is never finished. The more Mesopotamia was uncovered, the less tidy the story became. Origins blurred, influences multiplied, sacred and administrative life intertwined in unsettling ways. The first civilization began to look less like a clean point of beginning and more like a layered field of inheritances, omissions, and managed memory. This is why modern discovery can feel both liberating and claustrophobic. It liberates because it restores voices once sealed in earth. It claustrophobically narrows because those voices arrive through modern institutions with their own incentives, categories, and blind spots. The philologist, the curator, the archaeologist, the nation-state, the collector, the museum visitor, the documentary narrator, all become part of the chain through which the first civilization is allowed to mean something today. Recovery is real. So is rearrangement. Perhaps that is the final irony of excavation. The modern world approached Mesopotamia believing it was uncovering the truth beneath myth. Instead, it found that myth, power, archive, landscape, and interpretation had always been entangled. There was no untouched beginning waiting politely under the dust. There were only layers, each one shaped by the needs of those who lived above it. The archaeologist could peel them back, but not step outside interpretation entirely. No one can. So the trench lies open under a hard modern sun. Workers brush soil from a tablet no eye has seen in 4 millennia. A museum case glows in a distant capital. A scholar leans over a sign list. Somewhere, a looted artifact crosses a border in silence. Somewhere else, a mound still waits uncut, holding rooms no empire, ancient or modern, has yet been able to organize into explanation. The first civilization rises again, but only in pieces, and always through hands that want something from it, which may be why the mystery has not faded with knowledge, but deepened. For once modernity learned how to recover the buried world, it also had to confront an older discomfort, that even the most careful excavation cannot restore a past without also choosing how that past will live among the living. And in the spaces left by those choices, the most controversial theories continue to gather like mist, feeding on every gap the official story still cannot close. Where history leaves a seam, speculation enters like water through cracked stone. It does not always arrive as fraud or fantasy. Sometimes it begins as a perfectly human reaction to imbalance. Too many ruins without explanation. Too many symbols repeating across distance. Too many myths that seem to remember a disaster older than the surviving archive. Too many moments in which the official narrative, though grounded and careful, feels structurally incomplete. It is in those moments that controversial theories take root, not simply because people wish to believe strange things, but because the first civilization still radiates a peculiar incompleteness that invites the mind to search beyond the sanctioned edge of certainty. Modern scholarship at its best moves with restraint. It weighs context, dates layers, compares inscriptions, traces linguistic shifts, tests environmental evidence, and refuses to claim more than the record can bear. That discipline matters. Without it, the past becomes a mirror for appetite. Yet discipline cannot eliminate the emotional force of unresolved questions. Why do so many cultures preserve flood traditions? Why do some sacred symbols seem to migrate across enormous spans of time? Why do the earliest urban civilizations appear already burdened with memory, as though their own beginnings lay behind another curtain? These questions do not prove hidden continents, vanished supercultures, or impossible technologies. But neither do they disappear merely because responsible historians refuse to overreach. They remain, and in remaining, they attract interpretations that move farther out into the dusk. One of the most enduring of these interpretations is the idea of an antediluvian civilization, a world before the flood, older than Sumer or Egypt, whose knowledge survived only in fragments, myths, or sacred teachings. In mainstream archaeology, there is no accepted evidence for a single advanced global civilization erased wholesale before the known rise of urban states. The material record does not support such a conclusion. And yet the persistence of the idea says something important. It thrives because early civilizations themselves often speak as inheritors. Their texts lean backward. Their king lists stretch into impossible antiquity. Their civilizing wisdom descends from primordial sages. Their sacred centers stand above earlier buried phases. The theory may exceed the evidence, but the emotional architecture that nourishes it is already present in the oldest sources. A related current flows through archaeoastronomy and the study of ancient alignments. Some researchers, working cautiously, have shown that ancient peoples observed the heavens with great seriousness, tying celestial motion to ritual calendars, agriculture, kingship, and architecture. This is neither fringe nor mysterious. It is well supported across many cultures, but beyond this careful work lies a more controversial suggestion, that ancient monuments encode levels of mathematical or astronomical knowledge that imply lost systems of transmission, forgotten schools, or much older observational traditions than conventional timelines comfortably allow. Sometimes these claims dissolve under scrutiny, sometimes they overread coincidence, yet they endure because the sky itself is a stable archive. If ancient people repeatedly built in conversation with the heavens, then every unexplained alignment feels to some minds like a clue pointing toward a buried lineage of knowledge not yet fully mapped. There are also theories centered on symbolic continuity, the suspicion that certain myths, images, ritual structures, or cosmological patterns recur not because human imagination often converges on similar forms, but because fragments of one very old memory system survived under many names. Comparative mythology can support modest versions of this. Floods, divine mountains, underworld descents, sacred kingship, cosmic trees, heavenly instruction, and golden age motifs genuinely recur across regions. Cultural exchange, deep shared human concerns, and patterned storytelling explain much of this. But when the recurrence becomes especially striking, some move further. They imagine not only exchange but inheritance from a lost centre. Again, the evidence rarely allows the boldest claims. Still, the question itself reveals where the official story feels emotionally unfinished. If civilization has many beginnings, why do so many beginnings sound like echoes? Then there is the more speculative territory, once occupied by writers who saw ancient gods as misunderstood memories of advanced visitors, vanished technologists, or non-human instructors. Mainstream scholarship rejects such readings, and rightly so, because they flatten symbolic worlds into crude literalism while often ignoring the cultural richness of the societies involved. Yet even here, dismissal alone does not fully solve the deeper issue. These theories gained traction not merely because they were sensational, but because ancient texts sometimes describe the origins of order in ways that are difficult to make emotionally ordinary. Wisdom descends. Civilizing beings emerge from the sea. Kingship comes from heaven. The first cities feel recovered rather than invented. When official history insists on sober reduction, but leaves the symbolic tension unexplored, more extravagant explanations rush in to occupy the silence. It is also worth noticing how often controversial theories cluster around civilizations marked by rupture. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, lost Bronze Age systems, submerged coastlines, abandoned ritual centres. These are landscapes where flood, collapse, migration, and later reinterpretation have already disturbed continuity. Where continuity is broken, desire intensifies. The human mind wants an earlier order to explain the fragments. It wants an origin deep enough to account for the strange confidence of ancient monuments and the haunted tone of early myth. Sometimes that desire creates fiction. Sometimes it sharpens attention to real anomalies the official framework has not yet integrated well. The difficulty lies in distinguishing imaginative overreach from legitimate pressure on incomplete models. This is why the edges of scholarship matter, not because every fringe claim deserves acceptance, but because the border between careful doubt and excessive speculation is often where a culture reveals its hidden anxieties about its own past. The first civilization remains especially vulnerable to such anxieties because it occupies the symbolic role of beginning. If the beginning is unstable, everything built after it trembles a little. That is why people keep returning to the possibility that something older, wiser, or more catastrophic lies beneath the accepted timeline. They are not only chasing mystery, they are testing the strength of the story modernity tells about how order began. Some controversial ideas prove useful precisely by failing. They force archaeologists to refine chronologies, revisit assumptions, and explain more clearly why certain claims cannot stand. Others, though overstated, draw attention to genuine blind spots, submerged landscapes now under post-glacial seas, unexcavated sites, lost organic archives, underappreciated regional interactions, or the limits of preservation bias. The danger begins when pressure for explanation turns every gap into proof. A missing tablet is not evidence of a hidden empire. A mythic flood is not automatically a historical global cataclysm. A repeated symbol is not a passport stamped by one forgotten master culture. And yet the opposite danger also exists. The temptation to treat all unresolved patterns as trivial simply because they attract sensational readings. Perhaps the wisest place to stand is neither in surrender to fantasy, nor in the comfort of premature closure. The ancient world deserves a more patient kind of wonder, one that accepts buried coastlines without inventing Atlantis from every drowned shelf. one that honours archaic sky knowledge without needing ancient astronauts to justify it, one that listens to flood memory as cultural truth without forcing it into a single master event, one that understands that the first civilization may indeed have hidden its past, not by preserving a secret chamber of impossible technology, but by layering memory through myth, sacred legitimacy, selective record, conquest, moral recoding, and modern rearrangement until the original texture could no longer be recovered cleanly. So the mist gathers once more, not over some fantasy continent, but over the actual seam where evidence ends and yearning begins. Broken tablets, buried shrines, impossible rains, sages from the deep flood-divided ages, alignments under ancient skies, symbols that refuse to die. None of these require belief beyond the record to feel unsettling. They're already unsettling. Perhaps that is why the most controversial theories never vanish. They are fed by the same thing that nourished the first myths. The intuition that something important once stood closer to the beginning than history can now describe. And as that intuition lingers at the edge of the known, only one part remains to be crossed. If the first civilization was hidden by power, disaster, inheritance, theology, and even recovery itself, then what are we really asking when we ask why they concealed their past? And what warning might still be sleeping inside that concealment now? In the end, the question may have been shaped too simply from the beginning. Why did the first civilization hide its past? The phrasing suggests a single will, a closed chamber, a deliberate act carried out by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. But the deeper one moves through the old cities, the broken king lists, the flood-divided memories, the temple archives, the buried foundations, the inherited empires, the disciplined sacred histories and the modern museums, the less the mystery resembles one clean decision. It feels older than conspiracy and quieter than proclamation. The first civilization may have hidden its past the way human beings often do when survival becomes inseparable from order, by sanctifying what could still hold the world together and letting the rest sink slowly into forms no longer easy to retrieve. That possibility is less dramatic than the fantasies that gather around lost worlds, yet perhaps more unsettling. For if concealment was woven into ordinary civilization rather than imposed from outside it, then the first great secret of history is not merely that something was taken from us. It is that stable societies may require selective memory in order to exist at all. A city rising from marsh and floodplain cannot preserve every voice, every ritual variation, every failed lineage, every local explanation, every abandoned god, every prior foundation. To endure, it must organize. To organize, it must privilege. To privilege, it must let some things fall behind the wall. What later ages experience as mysterious loss may, in part, be the sediment left by the very process that made continuity possible, and yet that is not the whole of it. There are moments when the concealment seems more intentional, or at least more self-aware. Kingship descending from heaven, floods cutting memory in two, sacred wisdom attributed to primordial beings, temples rebuilt over older sanctuaries until antiquity remained present but inaccessible, dead languages preserved as learned prestige, older gods retained only under hostile moral light, archives gathered by conquerors who understood that to possess memory was another form of rule. These are not accidents, they are strategies, even when those who enacted them believed themselves to be preserving truth rather than editing it. The first civilization did not simply forget, it learned, very early, how to convert uncertainty into legitimacy. Perhaps that is why its ruins still feel less like silence than restraint. The tablets do not merely fail to answer every question, they answer in ways that direct attention. They tell of kings, offerings, omens, hymns, boundaries, victories, duties, cosmic alignments. They leave the ordinary world visible only in fragments. They preserve beginnings, but often through mythic distance. They speak of catastrophe, but in forms shaped by ritual and political need. Nothing in this is false in a simple sense. It is truer and more difficult to say that the record is already a worked surface. Beneath it lie older sediments of life and meaning that may never again be exposed except in traces. This, perhaps, is the real reason the first civilization continues to disturb the modern imagination. It occupies the place of origin in the story of human order, yet it refuses the clarity people expect from a beginning. Instead of a bright threshold, it offers a layered dusk. Instead of pure invention, inheritance. Instead of transparent memory, sacred selection. Instead of a stable cradle, a floodplain where foundations shift and are rebuilt over what they replace. The very civilization that taught later humanity to count, write, organize, and remember also revealed how memory hardens around institutions, how truth becomes inseparable from power, and how the oldest losses are often concealed inside the forms meant to protect continuity. There is a warning hidden there, though not the kind that announces itself loudly. It is not merely that ancient empires manipulated history, or that priesthoods guarded dangerous truths, or that later religions judged older worlds too harshly, or that modern museums still hold fragments of the dead under foreign roofs. All of that matters, and all of it belongs to the chain. But the deeper warning is stranger. Every civilization tells itself that its record is reality arranged honestly. Every civilization believes, at least in its official moments, that it has finally named the world correctly, and every civilization leaves behind silences that later ages mistake for emptiness, rather than evidence of selection. The first civilization may matter so much because it shows this pattern at its dawn, when the mechanisms are still visible in clay and mud brick. One can imagine, then, that the hidden past of Mesopotamia was not one thing, but many. It was the voices of labourers reduced to ration lines. It was local gods diminished by central cults. It was older shrines entombed beneath new holiness. It was ecological fragility translated into moral language. It was flood trauma compressed into a single civilizational wound. It was defeated cities folded into royal sequence. It was inherited wisdom, attributed to beings from the deep because the true pathways of transmission had already gone dim. It was older meanings recoded by conquerors, theologians, and scholars, until even preservation became another form of distance. This is why the mystery can never be solved by finding one lost tablet or one decisive theory. The concealment is structural. It lives in the very way history survives. And still, none of this should lead to despair. There is humility in it. The buried city, the unread corner of a damaged tablet, the shrine beneath the shrine, the story that survives only as a distorted echo in a later scripture or a hostile commentary. These remind the listener that the past is not an object to be possessed completely. It is a field of relation. One approaches it with patience, with suspicion, with tenderness, and with the acceptance that some chambers remain dark, not because truth is unreal, but because truth has passed through too many hands to remain unshaped. The first civilization concealed its past, yes, but perhaps it also left behind enough fractures in the surface that careful people, centuries later, would know not to trust polished beginnings too easily. So the plain returns one last time in the mind. Low reeds moving under night wind, distant water carrying moonlight in broken lines, the outlines of a temple mound rising from black earth, and somewhere below it, older rooms that will never feel air again. A scribe presses a final sign into clay. A priest recites words older than his own certainty. A ruler speaks of continuity while standing above buried interruption. Far in the future, an excavator brushes dust from the edge of a tablet and thinks recovery is the opposite of loss. But the earth knows better. It knows that memory is never only kept or destroyed. It is layered, weighted, chosen, displaced, honoured, and hidden all at once. And perhaps that is the softest, most difficult truth left waiting at the end of this long descent. The first civilization may have concealed its past because to face the full depth of origin is to face how fragile every order really is. Beneath law lies improvisation. Beneath sacred certainty, inherited fragments. Beneath the first city, older dust. Beneath the official beginning, a silence already shaped by what could not be carried forward whole. The ancient world did not leave behind a clean warning carved for modern eyes. It left a landscape of buried thresholds. And if there is any caution in that landscape, it is this. Whenever a civilization speaks too confidently about where it began, one should listen just as carefully for what has been placed underneath the floor, where it can still bear the weight of the future without ever being allowed to speak its own name.